Today, I'm delighted once again to be speaking with Jake Broe, a United States Air Force veteran who served for 6 years as a nuclear and missile operations officer. But of course, almost all of you, I'm guessing, will know him better as one of the most prominent voices on YouTube throughout the war, someone with absolute moral clarity about who is in the right and who is in the wrong in this conflict. He also brings direct military experience to his detailed analysis of the unfolding conflict. And of course, I have to say, does incredible work. Well, before we dive into the conversation, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who's bought me a coffee, become a patron of the channel, and the same supporting Jake with the tremendous work he does. I think a lot of people don't realize how actually intense amount of work goes into producing these videos. But also thank you to everyone who has supported our campaign, because as many of you will know, we are driving our 4x4s, our sort of trucks over to Ukraine tomorrow, actually, leaving on the ferry at midnight tomorrow, and driving them all the way across Europe to Lviv, where they will go to a workshop to be fully sort of done up and made battlefield ready. Quite a few of them will be turned into evacuation vehicles, which is an absolutely critical requirement at this time. We won't go into details, but it will save lives. We can guarantee that. We have got this campaign to help us cover the costs of that trip. And of course, we're hiring a film crew, we're doing some events, and we're doing a ton of interviews on the ground. So if you can't, if it's beyond your means to do that, then please don't worry. But if you do have the ability to support us in this campaign, it is massively appreciated. And of course, the link is in the description of the video. Now, into the conversation. Jake, welcome back.
Jonathan, thank you for having me back.
Well, before we hit record, we were talking about the media, and actually that leads very well into my very first question. Throughout this war, it seems that both mainstream media and analysts, and indeed the sort of specialist foreign, foreign affairs press, they've really struggled to assess realistically what is happening, what stage we are at of the war. There tends to be an inbuilt bias to presume Russia is stronger than it is, and there's an inbuilt bias to be surprised when Ukraine gains victories, and a sort of default assumption that they're losing. But also the narrative swings wildly between, Ukraine is back again, or Ukraine is about to be taken over. There doesn't seem to be, let's say, measure and realism in the analysis. Where do you get your news? Do you have any mainstream media sources, or really have you abandoned it for other forms of research?
I think for the average news anchor that has to cover all topics, either globally or in their country or area, they don't pay attention to the war day to day. So the information they're getting is part of Russia's disinformation networks. They're getting the Russian propaganda about the Orshnik launch in response to ATACMS being approved, and we're on the verge of World War III. Like, that's the message that Russia puts out that everyone is receiving. Now, I know it's BS because I've been paying attention to this war every single day for 3 years. But for the casual observer, or even the casual reporter who's handed a piece of paper from his editor saying, okay, this is the big story happening from Ukraine. We haven't talked about Ukraine in weeks, but mention this story. They don't have the full picture. But people like you and I paying attention to this war every day, we do. What news organizations do I follow closely? And it's the ones talking about the war every day. The Kyiv Independent, the Kyiv Post, Euromaidan Press, the Moscow Times, even United 24, they have their own media division that's excellent. So I'm getting information from the people covering the war daily because they understand it the best. And nobody understands why this war is still going on. I think the general public, the average American, maybe even the average European, they don't understand how can it be 3 years and either A, Russia hasn't collapsed, because that's what one side is saying, or Russia hasn't steamrolled Ukraine and completely dominated in this war, because that's what the Russians are saying. It's not a frozen conflict. There are slight changes, and there's active fighting happening every day. I just think the nature of warfare has changed. Landmines and drones especially, it's just so hard to advance on the battlefield because the battlefield has become so insanely deadly for armored vehicles. Like, that's something I don't think anybody was anticipating 5 years ago, that Russia's 10,000 tanks can't go all the way to Portugal. uh, due to new technology, due to javelins and HIMARS and NLAWs. Like warfare has changed, and I don't think humanity understands how it's changed. The next war after this one, it's going to be bad, especially concerning AI and drone warfare, which the Russians, the Ukrainians are pioneering today.
And of course, the North Koreans and Chinese are not just observing closely. I mean, one gets the impression that North Korean troops are there on the ground so that the North Korean dictator can actually learn these modern methods of warfare. That, of course, is terrifying if you combine this high technology with the sort of mass that North Korea and China could bring to bear on a future battlefield.
I think North Korea just wants a seat at the table. I think Kim Jong-un, the grandson of Kim Il-sung, he's a young guy. He's younger than I am, and he's got a very long life ahead of him. And I don't think he wants to just sit in Pyongyang for the rest of his life. So by cozying up to the Russians, if the Chinese make a move on Taiwan, I guarantee you North Korea is going to be supporting them because they want to get invited to stuff. They want to be included, even if it's a volcano lair and they're sitting around a long table plotting world destruction. I don't believe North Korea will ever invade South Korea because the South Koreans outnumber them 2-1 in population, but technologically they're just too advanced. It would be a suicide run. But North Korea has this massive military, and Kim Jong-un likes money. He likes satellites in space. He likes rocket technology. He likes nuclear submarines. So yeah, I think this is a new form of warfare for the North Koreans. Loaning out your troops or mass producing artillery shells when you don't care about safety regulations or production standards, and the people buying them from you are desperate. So yeah, North Korea is just taking advantage of the chaos caused by Russia.
And let's combine these two topics of media and technology because you're following things, in detail as am I and many of the people in our sort of group doing similar kind of things. We're also talking to a lot of people on the ground, and some of those conversations surface in the channel. And of course, some of those conversations, one has to be a little bit careful, but it brings the impression that yes, you've got this extraordinary, brutal, terrible attritional war, exacting extraordinary suffering. But you also get the impression of incredible technological advance and the sheer speed of it, which I suspect the media can't wrap their heads around. But I also suspect from conversations and events I've been to that actually the sort of military hierarchy, the military strategists have perhaps not fully grasped, and it depends country by country, of course, but not fully grasped the sort of revolution in drone warfare that's taking place, including seaborne drones. You've got the little vehicles, you've got a whole variety of airborne drones, incredible electronic warfare advances, and then you've got these fly-by-wire sort of fiber optic drones. We recently had Sergei Sumleni on the channel. He's actually been to Kursk, and he described the scene when thousands of these kind of fiber optic drones have been in use. He says it's like that part of Lord of the Rings where they go through the spider's lair. You literally have fiber optic cables hanging in trees. It creates an absolutely bizarre atmosphere, but at the same time, incredibly effective. Is that your view? I mean, you've got a much more military experience than myself. You talk to a lot of people too. Are we behind? Are we not sort of keeping up with this? And what's the impact of that?
Well, I think the Ukrainian government is behind as far as what's being done on the battlefield, because this is basement workshops, Ukrainians and even Russians tinkering and experimenting, trying to get an advantage on the battlefield. I mean, let's be honest, there's not really any rules to this war, and people are willing to do and try anything. So let me give you some examples of these technological innovations just from the last month. Uh, we have drones with shotguns on them, shooting down other drones in the sky. You don't have to be very accurate. You just have to get close enough. Shotgun. You can take down an enemy drone if one rotor goes out. Ukrainians also put surface-to-air missiles, small ones, on drone boats to shoot down helicopters. This is the first time in the history of warfare that a drone boat has shot down a helicopter. They also are now deploying FPV drones from drone boats in the Black Sea. This was an incredibly successful operation about 2 weeks ago. Ukraine sailed out drone boats, which are really drone aircraft carriers, that then, once they got into Russian controlled waters in Kherson, they launched FPV drones to take out Russian air defense systems. And you can see the video. The Russian air defense radar is spinning. It's on. It's looking for objects in the sky, but an FPV drone is just too small. And Ukraine successfully, a $400 FPV drone taking out $1 million air defense radars. Like this is, it's terrifying, but hopefully it's a good thing. Hopefully, the cost of these drones going down so much makes it futile for governments to think, well, if I just build enough tanks and armored vehicles, I can steamroll my neighbor and I can take their territory and steal their stuff. So I hope there is a future deterrent effect from the innovation and the creation of all these drones. Another reason why we're becoming so innovative is because human lives are valuable. There's just not a lot of young people in Ukraine, not a lot of young people in Russia. Russia is still choosing to do meat assaults. They don't care how many casualties they take. But for the Ukrainians, if you can figure out a way to save a life by using a drone, the cost is probably worth it. So that's been their primary focus the last 3 years, and they've been doing a fantastic job.
And of course, they've managed to clear the Black Sea. They've managed to achieve all sorts of incredible things and sort of reset the power dynamic on the battlefield. But they've been at this for 3 years. In fact, more than that. Of course, the full-scale war is now more than 10 years old. Russia began its assault on Ukraine in 2014. All through that time, we didn't support Ukraine to survive, but I think much of the democratic world adhered to the concepts that could broadly be defined as the post-World War II order, that violating sovereign borders is wrong, etc., etc. Now we have some extraordinary mixed signals coming through. I don't want to characterize the incoming Trump regime as uniformly bad, but there's some rather curious mixed signals coming through. One potentially of more than expected support for Ukraine and a sort of peace through strength concept, which is interesting. But also you've got this conversation about Greenland, Canada, Panama, etc. That concept of a sort of new imperialist, a new predatory kind of imperialism, that very much fits, it seems to me, with Putin's view of the world, the kind of dog eat dog version of the world. What's the impression you get of these noises that are coming out of the Trump regime that has not even taken power yet?
Historically, the post-World War II period, this is the Bretton Woods agreements. The United States had all the allies and the enemies sit down at a table. This was like in 1946 or 47 or something. And the United States told all the defeated colonial powers, the age of empire is over. We're going to establish a new economic order based on free trade and freedom of navigation of the seas. And yes, people's borders are going to be inviolable. We're going to end the age of empires. And this was a fantastic thing. Prior to this war in Ukraine, let's say prior to 2012, this was the most peaceful period of human history. I know it doesn't feel like that. We still had hot conflicts, Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, the Caucasus. But overall, this was the most peaceful period in human history. But humans have very short memories. And there aren't a lot of people alive today that remember the 1920s or 30s or 40s and the age of empires. But the age of empires is, I think, the natural state of man. It's what human nature gravitates towards. When you look at the last 10,000 years of human civilization, human culture, it's been based on war. It's been based on empires. You need to get big and attack and kill your neighbor and steal their stuff before they get big first and attack you, kill you, and steal your stuff. And because there is this instinct from humans, I think, for empires, we're now de-evolving back into it. So I'm at the point here in the United States where I don't think I can convince anyone of anything. Any American citizen who thinks it's a fantastic idea to take Panama, Canada, and Greenland by force, I can't reach these people. Like there's no civilized debate I can have with them about the need to respect international law and human rights and democracy. They're not going to be reached that way. So unfortunately, for the United States, bad things just have to start happening under Trump before people realize, oh, invading our neighbors, potentially killing them, and trying to take their stuff is actually doesn't really feel good. Kind of makes me feel bad about myself. Like we're not there yet, but Trump's going to test the waters. Uh, we could get further into it concerning his cabinet picks, but yes, it's a terrible message because it's the exact same thing Russia is doing now and China wants to do. I can't help but the first thing that pops into my mind is George Orwell's 1984 and the three superpowers that he wrote about in this dystopian fictional book: Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. East Asia is China, Eurasia is the Russians, and Oceania is, kind of like the Anglo-American sphere. And everyone saw this coming. Everyone in 1945, when the guns went quiet, Hitler was dead. They looked at, I think, the population of China, and they looked at the domination of the Russians on the European continent, at least everything east of Berlin, and then the new superpower, the United States, with our fantastic navy. And even Orwell said, if there's a World War III, it's going to be between these three people. And we haven't gotten there because the international rules-based order, the UN Charter, these have kept these have prevented World War III. The second that we abandon these institutions and norms, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions will die. We need to stop this. We can stop this today by stopping the Russians, by supporting Ukraine.
And it's been an extraordinary period of history of, and again, as you say, if you look at it from the sort of day-to-day news, it doesn't feel that way, but it's been an extraordinary period of increasing longevity, the average life expectancy, increasing wealth, increasing global trade, increasing innovation. The trouble is, you say, people take these things for granted. And you have this curious kind of mixture of isolationism versus projection of power. We don't know where that's going to go, of course. On the Ukraine side, it seems that it's perhaps far more nuanced and more complicated than perhaps we feared. I mean, during our previous conversations prior to the election, certainly you have some rather odd picks, but you have some people like Kellogg and others who seem to be, I would say, rather realistic about what Russia is and how you have to deal with it, characterized by this concept of peace through strength. James Gilmore, who I had the pleasure of speaking to, there seem to be many people, not just in the traditional Republican Party, but people who do have, a leg or arm or eyebrow in Mar-a-Lago, and at least can transition messages over to people who have a far more realistic understanding of the kind of mafia nature of Putin's regime. And if you want peace, what you're going to have to do to achieve that. Do you remain optimistic on that front that the US will not abandon Ukraine and we could see some interesting developments this year?
So let's hold the second part of that question because you were talking about why are all these cabinet picks so confusing and conflicting on the topic of Russia and Ukraine. And for people like you and me, we're seeing the world through the lens of this war because we cover the war or we're paying attention to the war every day. But that's not the test. For Trump, when he makes these decisions, Russia and Ukraine is not the test, whether or not I hire this guy or give this guy the job. There's other things that he cares about more. I think he cares about immigration and what people's position on that is, and he also probably cares about Israel. And does this person support Israel? If they don't support Israel, they're not getting in my cabinet. So Trump has lots of issues that he thinks about, cares about, talks about, and I don't think Russia and Ukraine. Maybe it's number four. Maybe it's number four on his list, but it's not number one. And we're getting a mix of people that have different positions and opinions. And I'm hopeful that when these people start debating each other behind closed doors in cabinet meetings, that the ones who understand the Russians truly, and what is America's real security interest. Maintaining the NATO alliance is in America's security interest. Sticking with the democratic, capitalist, wealthy Western powers, making sure that they're still our allies, is in America's national security interest. So during the campaign, all this fantasy talk of the Russians aren't that bad and the Russians are anti-woke and the Russians are pro-Christian and why can't we get along with Russia and even ally with Russia against China? This is nonsense. I mean, it might sell to the average American voter who dropped out of high school and doesn't understand anything about international relations. But for the adults in the room, they're going to have these conversations and debates with the people coming in who have been susceptible to Russian propaganda. And it's tough. Even if you sound tough on a podcast or you sound tough on a debate show or whatever, the second you're in a room with GS civilians or, a four-star general who's dedicated his life to serving America for 4 decades, are you really going to tell him he's wrong, that he knows less than you and the research you've done watching Alex Jones is the truth? So these are going to be real conversations that are going to happen with idiots who have fallen for Russian propaganda. They're going to have to meet with members of the CIA and the NSA. And I'm hoping once they have some clear conversations, they'll come around and they don't have to flip. They don't have to publicly admit they were wrong. They don't have to publicly support Ukraine. They just need to shut up and let the adults in the room make the decisions. And yes, it's in America's best national security interest to continue supporting Ukraine and make sure that Russia doesn't win, because if Russia wins, they're going to go on to the next war. And the next war probably will be against a NATO country.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been saying this on the channel for a number of years now. Who's next? And, Putin, it seems to me, his regime is now dependent on warfare. It's both eating the regime out from the inside. It's causing dramatic economic issues for Russia, which again have been missed by much of the mainstream media. Now it's starting to be talked about a bit more. But at the same time, if he was simply to stop the war machine, all the benefits, the wages, the money that's being pumped into the military-industrial complex and put into the pockets of people in the provinces who've never seen that much money, that would all stop suddenly. So he's got to keep these plates spinning. I can sort of see the dilemma he's created for himself there. But it means that when the crunch happens, it's going to be quite harsh. Again, Trump, it seems to me, has all the levers in his hand. He could crash the Putin regime if he chose to by yanking on all the levers that he can, lowering oil price by drilling and putting pressure on other OPEC members. He could close the loopholes. He could put pressure on the Europeans to close the appalling loopholes that are still open, the purchasing of LNG, oil as well, and letting Russia's grey fleet through the Baltic. And there's so many loopholes that haven't been closed. This is going to be interesting when he chooses to pull some of them, all of them, whether he has Ukraine in mind or not, or other reasons for pulling those levers. I think it could be quite dramatic. And I get the impression Russia's incredibly fragile at this point, very brittle. What's your impression from the sources that you see?
So the big story from this week, this is something I just learned. This former ex-Bank of America and Morgan Stanley executive wrote an article on Substack because he got
Craig Kennedy, lovely chap.
Yeah, Craig.
Yeah.
So let me
stuff.
see if I can explain this to your audience, what Russia has been doing. Over the last 3 years, the Russian federal government has spent about $250 billion on this war. And that's what we thought was the number. What have the Russians spent to conduct this war the last 3 years? 250 billion. No, it's not 250 billion. The Kremlin, Putin, has been ordering private Russian banks to give preferential loans to defense contractors so they can keep producing. And over the last 3 years, they've accumulated 250 billion in corporate debt. This is not on the government's books. This is not on the government's balance sheet. It's on the balance sheet of these defense contractors. And normally, a bank would only give a loan to a company if they thought the company could repay it. But the Kremlin is saying, ignore their balance sheets, ignore the fact that none of these defense companies have operated at a profit the last 2 years. They've all been operating at a loss while taking on increasing debt at insane, we don't know what the interest rates are overall, but I imagine they have to be at least 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. Like they're probably lower than the central bank's rate at 21, but that shouldn't happen either. Russia is breaking all of the rules of modern economics and capitalist economies to keep this war going. Now, 20% of national GDP in just corporate debt, this would be the equivalent of, let's say, the president of the United States forcing private American banks to give $5 trillion in loans to American defense contractors so that the United States could invade Mexico. And after 3 years of fighting, we only got 50 kilometers deep into Mexico. Like, it's stupid. Like, when you actually objectively zoom out and look at what the Russians have accomplished, where they started 3 years ago, they're about 50 kilometers deep into Ukraine, trying to take the city of Pokrovsk. And the only way these defense contractors can make the payments on the debt is by taking on more debt. That is exponential growth just to make your minimum payments. This is a house of cards. Now, people don't understand, where's the risk? Who's going to get wiped out? And it's Putin's oligarchs. Putin's oligarchs are the ones who have the equity in these banks that are going to go bankrupt. It's Putin's oligarchs that have the equity in these defense contractors that are going to get wiped out. So when this all collapses, yeah, it's going to be very bad for Putin and his government and the Russian economy. But we're going to have we're going to have fewer billionaires in the world, basically, once this house of cards collapses. And we're not that far away. Russia needs this 300 billion that's been frozen in the G7 countries. They need that money back just to keep things going in the short term after getting a freeze in the conflict. So the point you were making, that Russia has to keep this war going, otherwise his people will be unhappy that the $2,000 a month checks will stop in rural provinces. Yeah, there's a concern there, but Putin will just kill those people if they rise up against him once they stop getting payments. He needs his money back. So there is this strong incentive both to keep the war going and to stop the war. And the answer is both are wrong. Both will fail Russia. Russia is doomed either way. Maybe there's a miracle scenario where Ukraine capitulates, they steamroll, they absorb the people, they get control of the resources, and they can somehow stabilize everything over 5 or 10, 20 years. But I mean, that's just not likely, given everything we know about the Russians and how corrupt and incompetent they are. They can't fix this situation in the long term. Ukraine is suffering. Ukraine's in trouble. But we might not be that far away from a total economic collapse of Russia if Ukraine can just hold on a little bit longer.
Absolutely. And one of the things Trump has talked about, and this is where I think it can get quite interesting, because it does seem that Britain and the US have been trying to put pressure on Europeans to hand over that 300 billion. And at the moment, it's still being talked about in terms of sort of some kind of indirect schemes or put into an escrow account, whatever. No, it just needs to be handed over or translated into the munitions that Ukraine needs. It seems to me that if he was minded, Trump perhaps, in his inimitable way, could put pressure on the Europeans, which perhaps someone who's far more partnership and consensus oriented, that of course Biden was, couldn't achieve. Similarly, this narrative about GDP and the percentage of GDP going on defense having to move up to 5%. Trump seems pretty adamant about that. This is a radical change. And even if behind the scenes they settle for sort of 3.5%, that is still way beyond what most European countries are currently spending. I think Britain's at 2.3, 2.5. It's only a few of the Baltic countries and Poland that is anywhere beyond the 3.5%. This is revolutionary, and Trump may not have Russia necessarily in mind here, but if he forces the Europeans to get between 3.5 to 5%, this is absolutely transformational in terms of democracies shouldering the burden of defending themselves.
Can I give some advice to my NATO friends? If Trump is demanding 5 and the current guideline is 2 and the real number Trump is trying to go for is 3.5, just agree to the 3.5. Give Trump his win. I don't care if you meet that 3.5. Like, if it's officially 3.5, Trump can then tell all of his supporters, look what I accomplished. I got the Europeans to pay up. But I mean, that 3.5 can't happen in 1 year. It can't happen overnight. Like, if the new guideline was 3.5, there'd have to be a period in which they'd have to increase to that, increase to 3.5 over 5 years or over 10 years, whatever. I don't care if any NATO partner ever gets to that 3.5. And Trump eventually is not going to be president anymore and he's going to go away. All we need to do is see progress. So if Canada today is paying 1.7 or whatever, as long as next year they're paying 1.9 and the year after that they're paying 2 or 2.1, like as long as you're making progress in the right direction, no one's going to complain. No one's going to be upset. And Trump's not going to be president forever, both constitutional limits and his age. So the Europeans need Trump. They need him. And, through flattery, through through appeasement, ingratiation. I don't know what the term is to manage Trump, but the Europeans have to find a way. They have to reach him. We need this alliance to hold through his presidency so that we can come out on the other side intact,
And it's
holding
not
up
just a
against the
numbers
Russians.
game, because Europe has been freeloading. Britain has been freeloading since the Cold War came to an end. We thought that was it. We could disarm, and we could put it all into social security programs and so on. And behind the scenes, there's an extreme amount of disquiet about the state of the British armed forces. In some ways, some of our Baltic and Nordic allies are taking things more seriously than the current British government. So, to see Starmer in Kiev was encouraging. To see some of the conversations about the development of British bases and even perhaps the patrolling or inclusion of European troops to support Ukraine on the ground. But we're 3 years in. I mean, this stuff needs to happen an awful lot faster, I would suggest.
I would also say there might be a stigma in Europe or even the UK with military service. Like if you go into military service, then you're seen as like a failure. Like you weren't maybe smart enough to do something else. Like I don't know what the culture or the attitude is like in Europe or the UK. But I've been told that prior to the last 3 years. So no, go back in time, not the last three, but prior to that. If the average citizen of Denmark or Germany or France decided to enlist or go to a service academy, like what was the general attitude of the average European? Was that seen as honorable? Was that seen as,
I, in, in,
thank you for
in,
your service?
yeah. In Britain, it's not dishonourable, certainly. But of course, there's a difference if you're drafted straight into the officer corps and go through, a military training in one of the, like Sandhurst or something. If you're going for the sort of straight into the sort of officer training, no, I think there's a certain connection, and I think the Ukraine war has revived some of that connection. The understanding that it's not only not dishonourable, but it revives memories of the Second World War. I think that's one of the reasons why Russian propaganda hasn't quite penetrated here. We remember what it's like being under a barrage of lies from an authoritarian state. At that point, we learned how to fight back as well, and we even, as Peter Pomerantsev said, we developed a sort of dirty tricks department, doing our own propaganda to try and undermine Germany. We haven't done that. We haven't taken those steps. But I think many people have enough connection to relatives who fought in the Second World War to not just to have respect, but to have some kind of immunity from these authoritarian messages. At least I hope that's the case.
The point I was getting at is the culture in the United States is just different. If you serve in the military, everyone's nice to you. I commissioned in 2016 in the Air Force, and I was 32 at the time. So I had been an adult and a civilian up till age 32. I then went into the military, and I just couldn't believe how nice everyone is to me as soon as they find out I was either serving on active duty or even if I'm a veteran today. It's just this privileged status we give to people, regardless of the politics, regardless of the morality of the war in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever you served, whatever you did. There is this general appreciation. I don't want to use the word hero worshiping. Like, I'm no hero. I didn't do anything miraculous while I was serving. I think less than 5% of American veterans are ever see any kind of combat. But it's a choice. You give up your freedoms when you join the military. While serving in uniform, obviously you don't have complete freedom of speech. You have to be careful what you say about public office holders. You don't have freedom of mobility. Like, I couldn't get up and go on vacation wherever I wanted. I have to clear with my security monitor, like where I'm traveling and where I'll be and what I'm doing. So there are restrictions, haircuts and grooming and regulations, tattoos, stuff like that. So there's a sacrifice and it is service. And especially now being a YouTuber these last 3 years and seeing everything that the Ukrainians are going through, yeah, I'm incredibly proud of my time. And I wish there were more people in Europe that saw military service perhaps that way that we see it in America. Once again, I just don't know how they view it.
I think there is a difference in culture, and certainly I don't think people will necessarily. It's going to be much more on a personal level, but I think there are significant differences, as you've said there, and a realization that we're under threat, and that actually people going to service aren't just, the if you go back to the 90s and so on, the likelihood of being in a hot war was very low. So maybe people have forgotten what a sacrifice that is, what a risk people are putting themselves under. I think the threat now is enormous, but perhaps that sense of threat is not percolating through to everybody. You go into towns and there's really no sense that the largest war in Europe since the Second War is going on. There's no sense really. You have Ukrainian flags here and there, but you don't get a sense that in any way they're at war or under threat, and that's disturbing, actually.
Jonathan, I got a mind-blowing statistic for you. I'm gonna tweet about this next week, and I hope when it happens, it becomes like a big story. I want mainstream media to pick this up, but I'll mention it right now on your podcast. The Russians are about to approach 830,000 casualties over the last 3 years. The Russians are about to surpass the United States for our casualties in World War II. 4 years or 4.5 years of fighting in World War II, the United States suffered about 836, 34,000 casualties, and the Russians are about to surpass that. And once again, they've only gone 50 kilometers deep in Donetsk after 3 years of fighting. It's just unimaginable, insane. Over 10 million Americans served during World War II, so that casualty rate is high. Yeah, not as high as the Russians during World War II, or I'm not sure what the casualty rate was for the Brits, but um, I just I just struggle to comprehend how stupid this war is and how disastrous it's been for the Russians. And I still have to get hate comments every day on social media saying that Russia is dominating and everything's going according to plan and Russia will inevitably win and the West should just give up. And I just roll my eyes. I just don't understand.
It's extraordinary. Viktor Orban came out with a similar thing yesterday. Why don't we just lift sanctions? Why don't we normalize relations? I mean, it's beyond insanity, but it has that parallel with Stalinism. I mean, when you travel around Russia, you see these huge projects like the Belomor Canal and things like that, which were built at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. And then you find out that it was just a stupid idea, or it was in the wrong place, or you know, they thought it would be strategically important and it turned out to be a complete white elephant. And I think that's what autocracy does, or the whims of the autocrat. It creates these plans or ideas that are not evidence based. And then
If it happened under Stalin, maybe it wasn't a mistake. Stalin wanted those workers to die. He was trying to depopulate the minorities of his empire in order to enrich and empower the core territories, the Russians.
But if that same sense of wastelessness, if you have no value on human life, then the projects, whether you think they're going to have an impact or not, the projects ultimately are absolutely pointless. Well, let's turn back to the West, where human life fortunately still has some value, at least. And
For
something else
now.
we would, for now, and it's important that we keep talking about this because, human life, the sanctity of it is critical to things we talk about like rule of law. But the way people get their truth, the way people get their news, the way they form their sort of, bubbles and impressions and models of the world is radically changing. I think this is fascinating, isn't it? Because Joe Rogan invited Kamala Harris on, and for one reason or another, that didn't happen. But the Zelensky team has gone out of their way to get Alexei Frolov, or Fedotov, I think his name is. But anyway, Lex Fried, which is, as people will have will know him by. They really went out of their way to get him over to Kiev. And even though the quality of his questions was absolutely appalling, I think this is seen as something of a communications triumph. Has Zelensky realized something that many mainstream politicians in the West have not? And that is the place where people form their truth or an impression of the world has fundamentally changed.
Well, Zelensky is a former comedian and TV actor, and he had his own media company, and he's younger. So I think he just understands the changing nature of social media and the internet. And I just think there's a lot of people, Joe Biden's age, who don't get it. They don't get how the information sphere has changed. I don't even think I understood it. Going back in time to the election here in the United States 4 years ago or 8 years ago, people got their news and information, a majority probably still from legacy or corporate media. We were talking about this before the podcast started, but if you were an American politician and you wanted to get your message out, if you wanted to get a reputation boost with the American people, you wanted on NBC's Meet the Press, ABC's This Week, CBS's Face the Nation, PBS's NewsHour. Like millions of Americans tuned in to this once a week show where you could get your message out to the American people. But the tech giants created this new information arena. They created these platforms where people can get news and information 24 hours a day. And for the adults in media and information sharing, they're still clinging on to corporate and legacy media, hoping to publish their book next year to get their message out, hoping to get an op-ed in the Atlantic behind a paywall next month. And that's just not how people get their information. There are people going to the gym, doing their laundry, babysitting their kids or whatever, and they want to throw on a podcast. They want to listen to something. They're commuting to work. They want to listen to something. So people are turning to Spotify and Apple Podcasts and YouTube to get their news and information so they can form their opinions. They're not watching NBC's Meet the Press anymore. They're not paying a subscription to the Atlantic for an op-ed. They're not going to buy your book. So we need the best and brightest people in the world to abandon corporate and legacy media and get on social media. I understand there's a technological hurdle in the beginning. How do you stream? What kind of microphone? What kind of camera? But if you've got the money and resources, just pay someone to teach you how to do it. Start that podcast. I'd love if Gary Kasparov had a weekly podcast, or Ambassador McFowle or Ben Hodges had a weekly podcast. And let me show you what Russia's grand strategy is, because this was revealed in the Tenet Media scandal. The Russians were paying right-wing influencers, podcasters here in America, $100,000 a week to what it looked like not to do a whole lot. These podcasters were talking about and interviewing other people. And the Russians figured this out. If you want to build a massive audience and poison these people basically with Russian propaganda and disinformation, then you've got to have interesting people on the shows. You got to have athletes on the shows. You got to have scientists. You've got to have historians, sociologists, physicists, You need to spark interest to get a large audience. And then 10% of the time, when politics comes up, you make sure that when you're speaking about politics, you only have on people that support Russia. When you look at the guest lists of Lex Friedman and Joe Rogan, yes, you're going to find actors, you're going to find athletes, you're going to find very interesting and entertaining people. But if the topic of politics ever comes up, this person supports Trump, this person is sympathetic to Russia, it's the litmus test for these largest podcasts, the Sean Ryan Show, Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman. And these podcasts have tens of millions, hundreds of millions of views. Uh, the information sphere got crushed the last 4 years. Russia was behind it. And the West didn't see it coming, didn't understand what was happening. Now that we do, we have to course correct.
And this is something, where I think we're going to come back to again and again. I'm talking to a lot of people because in the context of this war, I have a lot of, I would say, sort of, Reaganite GOP friends who I talk to regularly. And I'm sure if we were to discuss domestic politics, they'd probably think I was a communist or something. But we find commonality in a whole range of issues, in fact, in more issues than we would disagree with. And I think that's an interesting way forward. But as you say, the liberal centrist media, or it's no longer, media as a structure institution. It's individuals now need to start learning. And I'm certainly talking to a lot of people about how that could potentially happen and what formats could be innovated. But I'm sure we'll come back to that again, because I think this is where the battle's going to be, and we're at the sort of bleeding edge of that. But hopefully it'll become more mainstream as things go on. Let's turn to and probably sort of end up in terms of one of the biggest conversations with his negotiations, because while the election was going on, it seemed that the messaging around that was really simple. It'll be over in 48 hours. It's, I'll talk to Putin, job done. Do you get the impression that there is more realism now in some of the noises coming out of the Trump camp? And indeed, some of the figures there are talking about it in a much more complex and nuanced fashion. They perhaps do not understand the full mindset of Putin, or the fact that he may not want peace at all. But it certainly seems that this simple, quick and dirty peace, they've come to realize that's not going to happen. And in fact, negotiations with Putin are either going to be incredibly difficult or else not even possible, given the sort of behavior that he is demonstrating.
Yeah, Trump was lying the whole time. The whole I can end the war in 24 hours. First of all, he claimed he could end the war within 24 hours of being elected. So that should have happened back in November. But then people were like, well, 24 hours after being sworn in, coming up this week. And no, General Keith Kellogg, his special envoy to handle these negotiations, he went on Fox Business and said the goal is 6 months. A victory for diplomacy would be if we can get a ceasefire within 100 days. So those are the adults. Those are the adults in the room. Trump's going to say and do whatever he wants. It's not based in reality. It's not based in facts. But for the adults, Marco Rubio is going to be Secretary of State. General Keith Kellogg, Mike Waltz is National Security Advisor. To my audience, I'm a single issue channel. I don't care about their domestic politics, the difference between conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans. I'm a single issue voter, and I just care who is going to do the best to help defeat Russia. I want to see the Russians defeated and for Ukraine to get real peace and security. So that's their goal too. That's what they want as well. The people who are going to be in charge of these negotiations and talks. And they're not idiots. Keith Kellogg, he's 80, so he's a child of the Cold War, and he served in the military under Ford and Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, maybe even Bush Sr. So he understands who the Russians are. He understands how they talk and operate. They lie about everything. You can't trust anything they say or do. And he's looking for a real deal. He knows what they want is unrealistic, and they're trying to get some kind of concessions or compromise. But you can only do that from a position of strength. And right now, the Russians look incredibly weak. To put this in perspective, Ukraine launched an offensive into Russia, taking close to 1,000 square kilometers of Kursk. And it's been 6 months. and the Russians can't even liberate and get back their own territory inside of Russia. And they're demanding the north bank of the Kherson, the Dnipro River, the city of Kherson, pre-war population 300,000. They're demanding the city of Zaporizhia, population 700,000. And Ukraine obviously is never going to concede these cities. And I don't think Keith Kellogg or Rubio or Waltz are ever going to entertain the idea that Russia can have the city of Zaporizhia. 700,000 people just handed over because Russia can't militarily find a way to take it. So these talks are going to fail because I think Putin can't betray the Z nationalists, the Z patriots, the Z patriots who want to go all the way to Kyiv, Odessa, Moldova, the Polish border. That's what they were hoping for. That's what they were expecting. And if Putin can't even get them a compromise where they get back Kherson and Zaporizhia, the cities, maybe Odessa or Kharkiv or well, there's going to be a lot of internal division and a lot of infighting in Russia over these talks. And Putin, there's no winning scenario. There's no way that Russia can have a freeze in the conflict and still look good. So you keep asking, well, what's going to happen or how does Russia win? And I just don't see a scenario. Like, I just don't see a year from now, we're still having the same conversation and the battle lines are more or less the same. Something catastrophic is going to happen to Russia soon.
And another realization, I think, and this is a very, very important one to keep repeating, and that is that peace on Putin's terms is actually incompatible with the very concept of a sovereign and secure Ukrainian state. And I think that's a key idea which Trump's aides are going to get more realization about as they start speaking, potentially behind the scenes or even, more in public with some of Putin's entourage. The sheer, I would say, unreasonableness of many of their demands is going to be a sticking point, and I can see them getting quite frustrated with that.
And I'm gonna say to you, I'm gonna toss this out here. There might need to be a transition period for MAGA to forget that Joe Biden was ever president and then come to the realization that Russia is a security threat. Because Joe Biden was a Democrat and he was supporting Ukraine, there was this reflex, this political reflex from MAGA conservative Republicans to just oppose it because that's what Joe Biden was doing. They just wanted to oppose everything. But as soon as Trump is sworn in, and let's say Trump says he wants a deal and he's going to end it and everything's going to be great, but the Russians then don't cooperate, we might need a transition period in the information sphere of 100 days for Donald Trump to tell his supporters, Russia's not cooperating. Russia doesn't want to talk. Russia's not agreeing to anything. Russia violated this temporary agreement that we negotiated. And then MAGA can just flip on Russia. The arguments are there. And as soon as the Democrats are not in control of anything, not responsible for anything, then I think this political reflex that a lot of people in MAGA have is going to disappear. And hopefully we can win these people over. I'm trying to reach these people. I want them on my side. They are not my enemy. I want America to succeed. I want our economy to grow. I want our political and military influence to expand, to create a more peaceful and prosperous world, not a new empire where we annex Panama, Greenland, and Canada. So,
And I think they're going to get stuff in these security briefings they'll be getting on a daily basis. We already know what some of that stuff might be. Russia has been causing terrorist acts around Europe of sabotage on the railway networks. They disrupted, it is alleged, the start of the Olympics in Paris because they weren't invited. We had bombs on DHL planes. One plane even came down in suspicious circumstances. In public, they're not saying it was Russia, but it's very odd that bombs transported in DHL aircraft then set fire to warehouses. And then last week, Donald Tusk, the Polish premier, didn't give any details, but he said that US intelligence has identified a very serious plot to actually disrupt aviation. I mean, this is ISIS level behavior. And this is going to be appearing, and stuff we don't even know about is going to be appearing in these security briefings. So this may well start to change minds.
Russia declared war on the West in 2012. As soon as Putin came back to power in 2012, Russia went into austerity mode to start saving up money because Putin was always planning on getting his empire back. Yeah. Russia is not our friend. Russia is not our ally. Russia will never go back to being a peaceful, democratic country in which they just want to engage in free and fair trade with their neighbors. That's just never going to happen. It's about empire. They want to dominate, they want to control, they want to enslave to enrich the core territories. They can't help themselves. Just, I think it's the geography of, the Eurasian steppes. And we need to end this cycle once and for all. I'm an advocate for breaking up Russia. Once Russia collapses, don't try and save it. Instead, focus on the regional areas and territories, and any region willing to give up their nukes and draft a democratic constitution, then we'll give you humanitarian relief, financial aid, food support, whatever you need to transition. But we have to stop this concentration of the Kremlin leading to these massive wars because it's just a cycle that's been repeating for 500 years. And I'm sick of it.
I'm totally 100% with you. And as you know, we have lots of speakers on the channel who are aligned with that idea, and trying to get some, Russian minorities or minorities who are part of that Russian Empire onto the channel as well. I think it's very important to have those voices and that experience expressed. For today, though, Jake, thank you so much for coming back on the channel. Absolutely sort of thrilling conversation. I know we went all over the place with lots of different topics, but I think they are all pertinent and incredibly important ones at this time as, yeah, 2025 shapes up to be another extraordinary, terrible, uncertain year.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.